use the mic. So let me stay here with the mic. Okay. So thank you for coming, first of all. I appreciate it. I live in that faraway town called Brewster. It's very, very far away. And the reason I got involved in history, you probably know there's a golf course called the Captain's Golf Course. Well, every hole is 2 golf courses, port and started, has a name, Captain Ellis, Captain Young. I've been playing golf for 20 years. Some guys don't even know the name of there. I said, you know the 4th hole is Captain Young? Oh, yeah, I know that. They've been said, they don't look. So I went to the pro. I said, who are these men? What do they do? There's no book about it. So about 6 years ago, I got to do research on that. Then I got hooked. So now that I'm retired, this is fun for me now. So I enjoy doing the research. So it's kind of fun for me to talk about maritime history. Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it. So let's talk about slavery on Cape Cod. Slavery is everywhere in every town, every minute. I mean that, literally. From the Mayflower days through the Civil War, there was slaves on Cape Cod everywhere, even beyond. But basically, until the Civil War officially ended it. The reason I call my book Incongruity is because Massachusetts has a distinct honor, if you want to call it that, of being both a slave. Boston was a hub of slavery for New England. All the slaves came in through the Boston Harbor and they're marketed there and so on. But then they became the abolitionists, they became the anti-slavery group. The Vigilance Committee, they called themselves in Boston. So they went both ways. They acquired the slaves and they kind of begrudgingly released them. So that's why I call it kind of an incongruity. Now this is a book, I found this old book, I think it was 1837. It's Torturing American Citizens is the name of the book. And it's just horrific. I don't recommend you use it because it's just not a fun book to read. It's really, but they talk about how they treated the slaves, not just in Massachusetts, everywhere. So it's kind of a hard read to do, but it does tell you some things. All right, so I'm going to go with some history. So I kind of, in my mind, the way I kind of brought my topic, so I want to know why would there be slavery at all on the Cape? Why would men, most of the men of good faith, they were religious people, they were hardworking people, they were Protestant ethic and all of this kind of thing. Why would they want to have slaves at all? So the first thing I looked at is the history, predating the Revolutionary War, predating that. So I found a lot of stuff. For example, every name you see up there, they all had slaves, and they all propagated slaves. They're going to do them individually. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but if you have a burning question, by the way, something, if I say something confuses you, or if you really, really want to raise your hand and say something, I will certainly allow you to do that, as long as it's not too long. So there was one guy named Maverick. We talked today about a Maverick as somebody who's, a straight shooter. He's kind of unusual, got a rogue. He does unusual things. Well, this guy was definitely in that category. He came from England, and he had a boat. He was given land in Chelsea. He had a boat that went from Chelsea to Boston. So one day there was an English fellow on his boat, and he heard this horrible scream. And he went outside, and there was a woman being raped. And he said, what's going on? What's happening? What's happening? He went to the owner, and he said, hey, don't pay attention. That's just my slave. And they told my male slave to get her pregnant. So, I mean, that was just the way they treated people back then. It was just commonplace. They just didn't have any respect for life. They just did horrible things. And he was definitely in that category. Dudley, it's interesting. Dudley was one of our first governors, back when it was a big colony. He himself didn't have slaves, but all of his children, all of his grandchildren had many slaves. So if you remember, it used to be called Dudley Square. At one time, there was a narrow passageway leading into Boston. Now it's called Nubian Square because many of the black slaves wound up living in that Nubian Square area. That's where the black slaves lived for many, many years. He was the first one to start that charter for Harvard University. Another earlier one, really early, Usher was even before we were a Commonwealth, even before we were a colony, we were a Dominion. So way back when, we had a Dominion. When the English first came over in 1631, Winthrop gave permission for people to become residents. You could live here. So he gave this English fellow, John Usher, almost half of Somerville who drifts into the ocean. He built a very elaborate farm by hiring black slaves, and all his descendants live there. So a lot of famous politicians, if you will, from 1630 to 1650, even beyond, had this slave called Ted Hill Farm. It was in Somerville, all built by slave labor. Another famous one, or interesting one, Charles Ascot. He, you know where downtown Boston, King's Chapel, near 5 Filene's near that downtown shopping area. King's Chapel was a church, and he was a member there. That particular year, in the year 1740, there were 55 congregants in that church who paid dues and went to parish right away, and they had a total of 219 slaves. So it goes way back. So slavery has been around for a long time, not just recently or occasionally. So you pick the year, you're going to find slaves, depending on the year. I would say it probably reached a high point on the Cape, probably around 1820-ish, even though it was illegal. It's probably a high, in terms of density, he had the most slaves per person that year. But he had a paper, he used to use this paper, the Country Journal, and he advertised 4 slaves in there. He wanted to recruit slaves for working for him. Another guy, the Dees family, they're from the Carolinas, and they didn't live here, but they advertised, and they sold slaves here. So they had a lot of papers and newspapers. They just advertised slaves, you know, buy a slave, 29 tomorrow, come, they tell you where to go, what time. It's an auction. And it was a horrible thing, but people would auction themselves off. And they would tell you what their skills were. It could be maybe husbandry, it could be which is farming, it could be carpentry, it could be a salesman, whatever the skill was. He would explain what the skill was, but you would buy the slave based on what you believe. Fannell's another one. We talked for years about changing the name, Fannell Hall. We never do. We have never. He was extremely involved with the slave market. So unusual about Fannell Hall is, number one, the slave market, pretty much when they came, was right there, right in front of Fannell Hall. When they brought the slaves over on boats, they would come from Africa and open up the square area there, and people would bid on the slaves right there. But the redeeming factor, later, again after the Revolutionary War, to some degree, it became the Center for Abolitionism. So they took that building over, and they had discussions, and they had groups, and eventually they won the day, so to speak, with a lot of help from other people. Timothy Fisher is another name you might want to know. He's a fellow came from Bedford, very, very big. He had some slaves called, his names of the slaves on the Scipio, Caesar, Tito, and Diana. There was a lot of Roman names. They left, for some reason, little Greek and Roman mythology names. It was very common to give them names. And a lot of times the slave would take the name of the family, the last name. You know, so that's the way they would do it sometimes. He had up to 120 slaves per visit, but he did about 4 big trips bringing slaves over here. All right, so then beyond that, beyond the slave that came over, we had slaves, indigenous slaves. That was a big part of slavery on Cape Cod. So the way that would work, if an indigenous person committed a crime, they stole your sheep or they did something horrible, you can imprison them, you can take them in and keep them captive for many, many years. So it was very common. And when there was war, and there were a few wars, we'll talk about that in a minute, once they were captured, they definitely became slaves sometimes for 10, 12, 15 years. So it was very common to have indigenous slaves. In fact, indigenous slaves outnumbered the black slaves up through the Revolutionary War. And then black slaves, became a little bit bitter after that. This is a woman who I know from Chatham. She was a Reverend Joseph Lauren, who was a member of the church. She didn't say what church, so I'm not sure what church he was connected with. But I mean, when you think about it, I read many Chatham, not just only Chatham, every town, the deacons and the pastors had slaves. So in early 1700s, if the ministry had a slave, I guess that's kind of okay to have a slave. You know, they didn't see that as being immoral, didn't see it as being wrong. It was just commonplace. So it was just the way they did it. But he had a slave, and her name was it tells right there. She wasn't that well, she was married. Her name was Nickerson, but she was Mercy Taylor, and the slave's name was Sabina, and she lived in Chatham for about 15 years. Another pastor, one of the first pastors, Church of Christ, in the year 1711, he had a couple of slaves, one indigenous and one black, and one of each. And he was very active in terms of what he did. But again, if you were a young Christian or whatever, I mean, you were just founding your religious spirit or belief, and if they have slaves, I just find that astounding that they would be so popular among the clergy. Another place in Truro too. There were a couple of places in Truro called Hector's Deck and Hector's Reach, and there was a slave Hector. Apparently, was very popular guy. He was walking around town. They allowed him to walk, which was unusual, but he could walk around town, greet people, talk to people. Very popular guy. So they named Hector's Avenue in all different parts of Truro in his name. That's the cover of my book. The reason I covered that book, there was a fellow from East Dennis, Prince Crowell. Crowell probably sounded a very familiar name to Chatham people, right? So we know a lot of Crowells. He was probably related, I would say, to the Crowells here in Chatham as well. But the reason I chose that book cover, he, for a couple of years, many years actually, 10 years or more, brought cotton from the plantations up north. So he didn't do slavery, but he abetted slavery. He helped slavery. He sold products to the plantation. He'd bring food back for the slaves to eat from Massachusetts. So he would definitely be making money off of slavery. So he was definitely in the category. But he began a project when I was young, probably when you guys were young too. A little box called a March of Dimes, a little pass box, and you put your coins and your nickels and it saves you money. Well, he began a project using that picture on the outside of the box, like a paper box, and the children or whoever, people in town, anyone could do it, go around, collect, and then the clergy would take the money and give it for anti-slavery purposes. So he became an anti-slave person. He was very much against slavery eventually. In fact, there was a story I read. He was talking in a church, and someone invited a black slave to give a talk about how dangerous, how poor he was treated. And the clergyman said, "I'm sorry, not in my church. I don't want black people speaking in my church." So he said, "I'm leaving. I'm leaving your church. I'm telling all my friends to leave your church as well." So he was very much a staunch abolitionist. So there was another whaler too. He's from this area, probably from China as well. Jonathan Holmes. He had a slave named Old Kid and Deborah. Now the way they would do in the whaling days, you could work on a ship, and there's different variations, but many of them, if you work for so many years as a whaler, you get your freedom. So that was a real incentive. You know, if I'm under slave, if I'm a slave and I'm fairly young or middle aged, and I work for 10 years, I can get my freedom. So that was a big endeavor. But the way they would do it, up to the Revolutionary War, indigenous people were most commonly used for whaling. And the way they would do that in Mashpee in particular, that's where they kept the indigenous people in Mashpee. They said, well, Mom and Dad would go to the store and buy curtains or blankets or food or whatever they needed to live. And then this guy would take a note, and then eventually they would go back to the parents and say, all right, you now owe me whatever the amount was, $500, let's say. And he would say, either you pay me that money, or I shall indenture your son for 5 years. And then 5 years later became 10 years. You know, they were never, once they began the ship, it was very rarely were they able to get off. And they did the most dangerous jobs too, in the indigenous people. Here's a fellow who came from Barnstable, 1790. He whipped this fellow to death. This guy was a lawyer. Trudell Smith, his name was. And he had a slave, and he took him to the town square. The slave did something which was deemed to be inappropriate, put him to the lash, and kept whipping, and eventually the guy died. And did you think a white person went to jail? No, he paid a fine. So there was no criminality involved. He paid a fine. That's all I had to do. That was another thing too, which I found interesting. Back in the day, if you committed a crime and you were white, you could buy your way out of being going to jail, basically. So you pay a fee to do that. If you're a person of color, a slave, indigenous, or black, you didn't have an option. If you got caught doing something wrong, and you were in deep trouble, you were definitely usually kept as a slave. Now in 1790, we had the first census in America. And it's interesting because Massachusetts did not have listed as 0 slaves, but that's very misleading. And the reason for that is because we definitely had slaves in 1790. I can tell you that for a fact. We're going to go over those numbers in a minute. But the state had a law that says you cannot keep a slave. I'll explain that to you a little later. But you can't have slavery, basically, after 1790. But in 1802, there was a federal law, the Anti-Fugitive Slave Act, which meant you couldn't help a slave. So think about that. If you're pro-slavery, right, you get in trouble. If you're anti-slavery, you get in trouble. So that's why it's so hard to find records, documents, logs, diaries. No matter which way, if you were for it or against it, and you wrote about it, you're in danger of your own protection. So it's very hard to find records about slavery. It's very, very hard. But you dig hard if you can find it. But look at Massachusetts. There was 379,000 people in Massachusetts, no slaves. supposedly. But then you look at New York, they had 2,200 people, 2,200 slaves, and they had 390. So New York had almost the same number of people we did in that year. But and that year actually it was called Maine and Massachusetts were together at that point in time, right? But you can see they had 220. We probably had, I'd say 250 would be my guess, an approximate number. But nobody would admit it. Nobody would admit having a slave. Then the next category I looked at, so I looked at the geography, I looked at the towns, then I thought about the religion. We talked a little bit about religion, but just a little more in depth now. So I looked at each religion differentially and then try to see if they had any commonality among them. And the Puritans, of course, they didn't mention more slaves at all. Puritans, I couldn't find much written at all. So they may have had a few indigenous slaves, but not many. So I don't think they really either took a stand one way or the other. They weren't for it, they weren't against it. Now, the Congregationalists, that was a little different story. Congregationalists are kind of verbally upfront against slavery. They would, most chaplains would say, I don't want slaves, I definitely don't want them, but I'll end it tomorrow. Or I'll end it next week. Or I'll end it next month. I'll end it next, that kind of thing. So they're, why? Because when you think about everything they did, and most of what they did, there's a lot of beneficial evidence, a lot of evidence that they benefited from slavery. So if you sold cotton, if you sold rum, if you sold plantation, a lot of the aleways would be caught here, they send them to a plantation, they give it to the plantations for the slaves to eat. So they were making money. They might not have been direct slavers, but they were making money. So as a result, they didn't, they weren't a very slow demise to it. Jewish diversity, Jewish people, less than 1%. But the Jewish are a little bit different. In their religion, you can be a slave, but for a very short period of time, and usually because you owe money. If you owe money to a person, you can't pay it back, they will enslave you for a period of time. And very few people do that. The Catholics are kind of very interesting. The Catholics, beginning with Columbus and before, had what they call the doctrine of discovery. So the Pope, in his wisdom, said, as long as you go into the North American continent, Canada, America, Mexico, South America, anywhere in America, and you're doing it to colonize, you're doing it to Christianize people, perfectly okay. We want you to, whatever it takes you to do, whatever you need to do to make that land civilized, if you take them under control, it's okay. So they were edgy, but they definitely were more pro-slavery than anything. There's nothing restricting the Catholics. In fact, they wanted slavery. They were not opposed to it. So there was a papal bull in Carretera, which promoted slavery all the time. In fact, when Columbus came back, he had an agreement. He came back from a couple of his trips. He said, I'm going to get 10% of any profit. So if you make a profit from American products in any way, I get 10%. So he was really pushed for slavery, because that was a big money maker. The more slaves you make, the more money. That was just the way they did it. I don't know about you, but I remember as a kid too. I marched in the Columbus Day Parade, way back when. Now we're talking about the 60s or 50s even. Columbus was a kind of that popular hero. Now, when you get that day, it's like Indigenous People Day. Now it's like a mixture. It's like half. Some Italian, really respect him. A lot of people say, well, he wasn't the greatest guy in the world either. So they were very careful how that populace changed over from my lifetime. Now, the Quakers were the first religious group to actually abandon the concept of slavery. They didn't want slavery. But even within them, within the group, there was a lot of mixed feelings. That's the picture of Brown University. So there are two brothers, Moses Brown, who was, anti-slavery, and John Brown, who was the founder of Brown University, was pro-slavery. So he used slaves that built Brown University. As all the slaves used at Columbia, Harvard, all our major elite universities were built on the shoulders of black people, all of them. This one is no different at all. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. The other thing that used to happen too, even before the Mayflower came, English ships would come to the shores, the Wampanoags, and just grab kids, people, mostly young people. They'll grab a slave and bring them back to England. So one year, this Captain Hunt from England grabbed a young fellow, his name was Squanto, or Tiscama, we call it, right, and brought him to England. And he was enslaved there for a number of years. Eventually he went to Spain, and luckily got hooked up with some Spanish monks who said, where are you from? And they kind of talked to him and so on. By the way, he learned English and Spanish. He was learning in his native language, so he was trilingual. But eventually, when he got to be a certain age, they brought him back here, and he was helpful for the covenant. I mean, for the Puritans. The Puritans actually was in the plants with corn and all of that. So Squad was celebrated as a hero. They're not sure, but they think he's buried on the Eastwood Hill, probably the 14th hole, roughly. The other thing that kind of bewildered me too is that you could also have involuntary servitude. You have voluntary and involuntary. So I'll explain the difference. So if you wanted to come to America and you lived, let's say, in Europe, the principal countries would be Germany, England, France, Spain, Wales, Ireland, those countries. You could come. And the way they would do it, typically, you would just get out. There's two ways. But one way would be on a ship, and when you arrived here, you go to like a market, almost like a slave market. And they would say, here's a 22-year-old woman, and she's good at making clothes, and she has skill to do other zippers and buttons and whatever. She can make outfits for you and so on. So they would explain what she could do, and then people would bid on her. So that's one way. So they would come over, and that person would then pay the captain for the fare. So even if you didn't have money, if you were in Europe and you had a skill and you wanted a company, there was a way to do it. The other way is pre-contracted. That was a little less popular, but in other words, say you had a cousin or a friend over in Europe and you knew someone that had he had the ability to work in your factory or whatever, your store. You could just make an agreement, they come over, you pay for it, and then they work for you. So it could be either way. But then you have involuntary servitude. It really surprised me. They would take people in the 1700s from prisons, from orphanages, from a large institution, and bring them over. Many of the buildings in Springfield were built by people with one big prison. There's an ad in the paper to the building contractors. You can hire slaves through this company. And they got their slave labor from, literally, people call slave labor. It's literally what they were. They didn't have a choice. It's like, you're in a prison now, so you're going to go to America and you're going to build buildings. So there was involuntary servitude as well. And then the indigenous people I talked about before, but basically we had two big wars. We had the first war was the Pequot War in 1636, as the way in the beginning. And that was pretty regional for Europe. Pequot is mostly Connecticut, Massachusetts. Wampanoags were involved in that, so they're in that tribe, part of the Iroquois nation. 700 people were captured during that war and all went to slavery. Then we had the King Philip's War, which was much bigger in scope. That they went all the way to New York, King Philip's almost, 1675. And that's how they paid the soldiers. So if you were a colonial captain, a lieutenant, whatever it was, so like a sergeant might get 2 slaves after working, after finding the battles for a year and a half. Someone gets 3 slaves, someone gets 4, depending on your valor and your title, and you're normally paid by slavery. But think about this. The people got very frightened after the King Philip's War, because the indigenous people then realized they're not going to win this. They knew that the bigger and bigger numbers of Europeans kept coming over and over. They knew that it was a losing battle. They knew their land would eventually be taken over by European people. There was no doubt about it. So when they thought about that, they kept thinking about it, saying, well, what would you rather have? Would I'd rather have a black person who doesn't speak the language, coming from Africa, West Africa, who doesn't know the area, doesn't have any friends here, or would I want an indigenous person who knows the area, who has connections, who has friends, and is really hostile to us, very, very aggressive. So the concept began changing from, indigenous slaves, not maybe too advantageous to keep indigenous slaves. And that's why, in the 1800s, that's when it stayed popular, much more popular than black slaves. That's what, even though it was officially illegal, that's when the numbers actually physically went up for slavery. We talked about voluntary slavery, so let's get that one. Now the British would bring slaves over too. This guy, John Hawkins, brought a lot of slaves to Boston. There's one boat I read about, I think about 200 one time and 300 another. Now, the Queen wanted to give him a royal crown, not a royal, an official appreciation, the coat of arms. So if you see the coat of arms, in his coat of arms, he has a little black slave saying and the Queen had to give his blessing to the coat of arms. So she saw nothing wrong with having a slave as part of a person's coat of arms. Now this is another little story. So everyone here has heard of a guy called George Washington. I'm pretty sure you've heard of him. So he had a slave called Ona Washington. So when the capital moved from Philadelphia to New York, New York to Philadelphia, Ona she had to move, and they had to move. So George had this slave, who was actually Martha Custis' slave, but she was much more wealthy than he. So he had no choice. But when she went to Philadelphia, Ona did, Ona realized that God, some of these black people are free, some of these people can own a shop, some of these black people can just go to libraries and talk to each other and have venues. She said, why can't I do that? So she ran away, literally ran away. She ran in a boat and she traveled up the coast up to Rhode Island. And Washington had to be very careful, obviously, as the president at the time. If he was too lenient with her, the Southern people would be very upset with him. They wouldn't want these black slaves running away and getting away with it. If he was too severe, the northern states wouldn't be too happy either. So he had to be very cautious. So he sent delegates, people, to negotiate with her, enticed her with money and gifts and saying, please come back, I want you to come back. Otherwise, he had to pay the Custis family, because that was the rule back then. If you lose a slave out of a runaway, you got to pay the family. So Washington had to pay the Custis family money to get their slave back. She never did come back, by the way. She went to Europe. She finally said, nope, I'm out of here. Now, Sally, the boat to Sally, this is kind of the beginning of the end for the Quakers. The Sally was a boat that the Quaker group, as a group, commissioned. They brought 200 slaves over. Well, if you came over on a slave boat, you had a very tough time. As you can see, they were very rarely allowed to go above board. Usually they were chained up below board. If you got ill, could you imagine someone dying next to you? It happened frequently. You were in trouble. There's nothing you could do. You couldn't treat you. They didn't give you any special treatment. Someone died. Oh, too bad. You had to continue your journey. As a result, probably about a third, they say roughly about a third of people who started the journey as slaves never came over. This particular boat was even worse. This particular boat, which the Quakers sponsored in 1764, it began with about 200, and less than half, I think 90 or something, actually made it to freedom, actually made it over here. That's when the Quakers said, how inhumane. People jumping overboard, people killing themselves, people killing each other. Could you please kill me? I mean, I don't want to be a slave. I don't want that life. So then they realized how barbaric it was to be a slave. That's when the Quakers finally made the decision. I'll tell you one more funny story too, not funny, but unusual story. There was a national convention one time for Quakers. It was held in New Jersey. And a fellow named Benjamin Lundy went to it. And he was giving a speech, and he said he was anti-slavery, no one should have a slave, it's immoral, it's wrong. And his coat had a little bag of blood. So he said, and if I ever see with a slave, I will kill myself. Took out a knife, plunged it into the bag, and it was blood spluttered out like crazy. People thought he killed himself, but he was just acting, he was just kind of an attention getter. But that didn't change his, I didn't go for anti-slavery, but he tried. He made a valid effort. Now this is the original symbol of Massachusetts before we had a colony. You see an indigenous person there. You see that ribbon that's flying above his neck there? In the ribbon it says, in God, and it says, come over and help us. Come over and help us. Now I'm not too sure, but I don't think indigenous people woke up one day and said, oh, let's have the Europeans come over and help us. I don't think I was there idea. This was a European idea. We'll come over, we'll help you. We'll take your land, we'll settle here. So that's why they're considered indigenous people. They don't really know, really no standing what's to speak of. They really have literally no standing. There was a law that was passed, and supposedly it was an anti-slavery law, believe it or not, called the Liberties Act, 1648. And so we allow among us no actions to be inhumane, barbarous, or cruel. And no one should be beaten with more than 40 stripes, lashes, that's a lash, for a crime. So, I mean, that's pretty harsh. 40, you could die. Many of them did die. So if you could be for one crime, whatever that crime is, stealing porridge or something, I don't know, you could be whipped out practically to death. So they thought that was they thought that was like a savior for the black people, for the slave people. It wasn't really. Here's where he got a big change on this. Was a federal judge in Massachusetts, William Cushing, who had 3 or 4 cases in a row in the late 1700s. One case with Claude Walker, a guy from Barry, Mass. And he was a runaway slave. But the reason he was a runaway, primarily, because he was being beaten almost every day by his master. He was treated very purely and just really hard treatment. So after the judge heard all the story, he just said, just go free, you're free. In fact, he not only gave him his freedom, he actually gave the other fellow a fine, which is, I guess, appropriate. And then there was a mom bet case, another case of a woman. She lives on the South Shore of Massachusetts. No, she lives in the western part. I'm sorry, she lives in Stockbridge. She was in Stockbridge. And one day, her sister was going to be killed. The woman had a frying pan. She was going to hit her sister right on the head. So mom bet intervened, stopped her, tackled her basically, and there was a court case. How dare a black slave tackle a white woman? How dare that happen? So this judge again heard that case, and then he said, this was the third case he had where the slave owner was being very mean and cruel. So he said, that's not right. It's not right. It shouldn't be. So as a result, he said, there shall be no more slavery. So the way they got around that is the 1790-ish, where they said they would continue to indenture you. So if you had a slave and you wanted to keep a slave, you would say, I'll tell you what, I'll do a contract with you. If you work for me for 10 more years, I'll give you different benefits, I'll give you this, I'll give you that, but you're still going to be here. And they didn't know any better or had no choice, basically. They didn't know many people, so they usually took the deal. So slavery continued. In fact, it grew to be a little bit bigger. Another British guy too, Francis Bowen, he is called the king of the slavists. He's not American, but he brought a lot of slaves to Cape Cod, a lot to Boston. One time he had 2,000 slaves on his boat at one time. And when he came to Boston that day, what they did was he was apprehended, he was caught, and he wanted to bring him to trial. And all of a sudden, the day before the trial, he managed to get away. And people said, how did that happen? The sheriff said, I have no idea. Meanwhile, we know there was money exchanged, and he was bribed basically. So the sheriff just took the bribe and let the guy escape. That happened twice, by the way. So we talked about how the sea captain really didn't want this to happen. They really didn't want slavery to end because of the indirect benefit. So you had Prince Crowell from Dennis. He was involved with cotton, tobacco, and plantation, did that for years, then became an anti-slavery guy. Elijah Donovan-Jarvis was another one. He sent a lot of food down there. John Bowles was from Harwich. He did a lot of fishing parts of camp. So you can see it was a common thing to people to make money. So it was not unusual to keep the business going, the slave business going. But then there's some good stories. This guy, Russell Marston, I found that finally some of the people at Prince Crowell was one, he's another one, Burse, who was a slave trader for 10 years. And his job was, when the slave ship came over, he was separating them. Okay, fellows go here, young boys, father go there, mother goes here, children go there. He was separating them. And finally, this got to him. He said, I couldn't stand this in his book. He wrote a book, by the way. If you want to go to the library, it's Sturgis Library. It's called Reminiscences of Slave Trade. It's about a 90-page book. You have to put on white gloves and the whole thing, but you can actually look at it. It's his book that he actually wrote, talking about the horrors of slave trade. So he became the harbor master of Boston, and the reason he did that, because once he was an anti-abolitionist, he knew all the sea captains pretty much by name, who were pro-slave and who was anti-slavery. It's the other way of mechanism to get those slaves off the ship and to safety, so he would help them to runaway slaves. So that's why he did that. I'm going to show you. You'll see an example of that later, by the way. And then the black whalers, I told you about black slaves getting their freedom. So here's an example. This guy, Absalom Boston, was out of Nantucket. He was a freeman. He was actually a free man. He was the first big black sea captain. He was a whaler, and his entire crew was free black people too. So that must have been quite a thing. Could you imagine going to a southern port and these guys see this whole black crew? Must have been shocking to a lot of people. What's going on here? But he survived. He did really well for himself. He had a young daughter who tried to enroll in the Nantucket public schools and was denied. Because back then they said, we don't take black children. It's just not in our policy to take black children. So he and a couple of friends fought that. They won. That same judge, Judge Cushing, said, no, you can't go to public school. He eventually won that case. Another fellow, if you want to read some really stirring stories, this guy, Paul Cuffey, a great story to read. If you don't know anything about him, I suggest you learn. He began a thing called, he didn't begin it, but the president did. He consulted with 3 or 4 different presidents. He was around for a long time. He was very affluent, maybe one of the richest men in America. He and his cousins, his brother-in-law, his friends, and so on, they worked mostly out of Westport, Mass, in that area, that place in Westport. He began doing whaling, and they made a lot of money. And so some presidents had an idea. Even President Clay, as far along as Henry Clay, said, well, let's take all the black slaves that we have now in America, we'll send them back to Africa, and they could be free. But they didn't do that to free them. They did it because they didn't want the mixture of blood. They didn't want the blacks and whites. They wanted them separated. So he was in that domain for a long time. Coffee said, I'll do that. And finally, he was the main kind of leader, so to speak. And finally, near the end of his tenure, so to speak, he said, you know what, the more I think about it, he said, no, the principle of America is all men are equal. It's not right. It's not right for us to segregate men based on their race. He really completely disavowed that he really brought that concept. So at that point in time, it changed quite a bit. But the OCS movement was really big for a lot of years. As an example, you've heard of William Garrison. Well, William Garrison was he's called the abolitionist, the father of abolitionism, if you will, the head man. He was in Harvard a number of times giving a speech. He had a newspaper called The Liberator. So every time on an unusual story that it was anti-slavery or negative towards slavery, he would publish it. So there was this woman named Jane Johnson. This one captain, Captain Hannon, took money from her, said, I'll bring you to freedom. I'll take you from North Carolina and bring you to freedom up north. And then after he took the money, the boat landed, and then he had a way of contacting the owner with his reps there, and then captured her, and took money from the owner. So he made double money. Money for her and money from the slaves. So they would publish stories like that, and that kind of get people incensed. And the more they did those stories, people said, that's completely bonkers. You shouldn't have slavery. You should not be the norm of our country. A fellow from Harwich, if you heard of Jonathan Walker, he was a slave saver. So he one time had some slaves in Florida who wanted to get freedom. He cruised down to Florida from Harwich, was trying to save them, and was caught because there was the Anti-Fugitive Slave Act. It was illegal to help slaves, remember? So he brought them, he tried to bring them slaves. He got a little bit out of port, he was captured. And they went down to Florida for prison. And they kept him in jail for about a year. And finally didn't even have a trial, but they took his palm of his hand with a branding iron and just put SS into his hand. So he was called a branded man. I think he's the only one that I know of in American history who's ever been branded. No other punishment. The other guy too, Jonathan Bourne. The town of Bourne is named after this guy. He made a lot of money. Jonathan Bourne had probably 17 different whaling ships. Made a lot of money. When it came in 1860, it came time to elect a new president, the first Republican convention ever. Most people did not want Lincoln. Most people wanted Seward. Seward Foley, remember that guy from the cabinet? Right? They wanted a different man. So he was very influential. He said, I think Lincoln would be the best choice. So Lincoln, he kept going for his politics and so on, and he influenced a great deal. Eventually, Lincoln did become the president. So that was a big question. It came that close. I always wondered, how would our country be different today if Lincoln was never president? It would be interesting to see how different it might have been, or maybe not. Here's a vigilance committee. The Vigilance Boston Committee, there was a group of people. Beers was one of them. William Lloyd Garrison was definitely there. Russell Marston. Have you heard of him? There was a big restaurant in Boston for years and years called the Marston Restaurant. And it was run by all black people. The ladies, the managers, the cooks, it was all black people. And it was the only restaurant in town where blacks could go to eat. It was the only restaurant in town where women could go to eat. If you were a woman, you had to be accompanied by a male. But he would allow women, blacks, he just opened it to everybody's restaurant. So he was kind of way ahead of his time. But he was on that committee too. Frederick Douglass was on that committee. Lucy Stone, suffragette, who actually pushed to get women to get the vote. She was on that committee. Richard Dana, 2 years before the mass. So we had a lot of influential people living in Boston who eventually fought for slavery, fought for anti-slavery, fought for abolitionism. You see the boat right there. Remember I told you that Bruce became Boston Harbor? So what they would do, if a captain knew he had some slaves he was trying to smuggle in as an underground railroad, they would meet that boat, that sailboat would go maybe a couple miles outside of Boston. And then the rowboat would come, meet them, and take the black slaves onto the rowboat and bring them to Boston for freedom. So that's how we did it. So that's kind of, he saved a lot of slaves. He saved an awful lot of slaves. Harwich has had a big convention. 1848, the largest anti-slavery convention was right here, right by near Brooks Academy, actually. It was right across the way, Madison Line. Some of the speakers were Garrison, Stone, Douglas, they all spoke. But they really came to the conclusion that there can't be a union, you can't have a country if you can continue to have slavery. You can't continue treating people differentially. But the sea captains didn't like that in 1848. So eventually they saw a group of people who mostly were associated with sea captains storm the stage. Nobody got hurt, luckily, but almost. I mean, they ruined the platform, they tore it in shreds, chased all those people we talked about, Douglas, out of town, and they got to safety, but nobody got hurt. However, the good news is they came back in 1860, another conference, almost in the same spot, a couple blocks away, and they finally said there has to be an end to slavery. And at that time, it was much more sympathetic. People first said, yeah, you're right. We have to end this. So it's interesting how that evolved over time. All right, the last part of my little presentation is some black slaves who lived in, all these people lived in Massachusetts. So Frederick Douglass, not educated by the way, not formally educated, but a brilliant man, great speaker, very articulate, was raised in slavery, finally made it to Philadelphia, but finally made it to New Bedford. And he met up with Garrison, and Garrison said, "You are amazing." He kept saying the dangers of his life and how he lived and how his parents lived and all his relatives. And people said, "You're very convincing." So he brought everywhere the Garrison went. He brought this guy Frederick Douglass, who spread the word to be anti-slavery. Now, if you're going to come way back, I wrote one of the first black slaves in Salem. We had the Salem witch trial. This woman named Tituba. And there was 11 women who were accused of being a witch. She was the only woman that lived, because they accused women of being a witch and they weren't. So they had to say, confess. She confessed, and she was. She was from Jamaica or some Caribbean island in Jamaica. But she said, yeah, my country, voodoo and something akin to magic, is in there, black magic. So she said, I admit it, I do slavery, and I do black magic type thing. So she was excused. If you read the play The Crucible, she's a big character in the book. Also during the American Revolution, Crispus Attucks, the first American who was probably killed, this was before, a couple of years before the American Revolution, was this guy in the Boston Massacre. He was a black slave, ran away from Framingham. He was kind of between whaling victims, so he was a whaler. He wanted his freedom by being a whaler. It's reported he threw a stick and mud and stuff and different things at a soldier, and they think that soldier kind of felt he was knocked over by the stick, so it must have been a pretty big sized stick on the stone. Because I mean, if you're knocked over, you would think you're going to be attacked. I mean, it wasn't a weapon, but it was a weapon. I mean, that's pretty heavy to be knock someone over. So he shot into the crowd, and sure enough, he was the first one that killed Crispus Attucks. You see him there with the baton in his hand. Well, there's no story about that. To take too long, I won't tell you that one. It's too long. The runaway slave, you know where Mary Downey Avenue is? Yeah. So she was a runaway slave advocate. So if you go to, she had a little farm, actually a pretty good sized farm, pretty much with a couple of golf courses today. And she would allow, if a runaway came and made contact with her, she knew a lot of connections. She would know who to contact to get them here. Slaves would love to come to the Cape, because if they came to the Cape, they could probably make it to Provincetown. And if you could make it to Provincetown, almost every day the fishermen go into Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to Canada. So that's perfect. So that's where they were. They didn't feel safe in America. Because even if a slave came to America, they could still be under the anti-slavery act. They could still say, we're going to grab you back. So it would be safe to go to Canada. That's why a lot of black slaves wanted to go to Cape Cod, because they wanted to continue the journey for reason enough. Phyllis Wheatley was a brilliant woman too. She was, again, not formally educated, but she wrote in Greek and Latin. She was taken in by the Wheatley family, and the daughters taught her some Greek and Latin poetry. And she began writing in Greek and Latin, some really eloquent verses. In fact, President Lincoln invited her, the Queen of England invited her. The unfortunate part about Phyllis, and near the end of her life, she married a real disaster of a man who treated her really poorly, and I wanted to take poverty. She made a lot of money, but the husband took it all, spoiled it all for her. So she died very, very poor. Sojourner Truth is another black woman who lived in Massachusetts. She lived in Pittsfield, but she was more than just an advocate for anti-slavery. She was pacifism. In fact, she began a farm, and she's for women's rights. She's a temperance movement person. So she believes in a lot of social issues in general. And she frequently talks to the lecture about maybe things that she can do to help. This guy from Charles Ray, he was actually born in Falmouth originally. Went to New York, became a pastor of the largest church in New York City, and was a pro it was an anti-slavery church, basically. He began a newspaper called The Colored American. It was a very popular thing, just like Garrison had the Liberator in Boston, the other Colored American, which was anti-slavery newspaper article. And we're getting there, only 2 more to go, I think. So Sergeant Gooding, we had, of course, the 54th Regiment Army in Massachusetts, an all-black group. You've probably heard of them. In fact, if you go to the Boston State House, right in front of it, in the front door, there's a statue across the street by St. Codell, same guy who did the Lincoln Monument. Designed as frieze, and you can see this Sergeant Shore, the American, the white guy, Sergeant Shore, and all the whole battalions, all black. He had one of the people in his group, Sergeant Gooding, who was a member of that group for the first year. When the first shot was fired in down in the south, he was in that group. He was among the first group. But he eventually wrote a letter to Lincoln, and he had 2 questions for Lincoln. He says, "Mr. President, number 1, why are the black soldiers given better, inferior housing? The white soldiers have better tents and better homes and better this. We don't have that. They were segregated. So black soldiers had to go somewhere, and the whites had another. How about the food? Same thing. The whites would get a better meal, we get a minimal meal and different quality. So he said, and the money different too. And so he said, why do the black people get less money or no money? Why did that happen? Lincoln never answered. He wanted to, but again, he couldn't answer because there was didn't have a way of responding at that point in time. So that's my final slide. My takeaway is slavery has been here for a long time. There's different types of slavery, different degrees of slavery, but it came a point where eventually we just kept building and building. If you read the literature and keep reading books, you can just tell 1860 was such a pivotal point because there were so many things building up. And the country was just probably ready to explode, very volatile. So if there wasn't a civil war, who knows, what would be more of a disaster. So that's number 1. In the Fort Sumter, we talked about, that's where James Gooding was right there when they fired on Fort Sumter. From the slave. Phew. Did I put anyone to sleep here? I didn't hear snoring. Good. Thank you very much for your attention. If you want to, I still have 2 books in the front here. One book is a slavery book we talked about here. This book is a sea captains of Cape Cod. I wrote this a couple years ago. This talks about every town in Cape Cod, and I picked 5 captains for each, why they're kind of famous and what they're known for. So it was available. Only $20. You don't have to, but I would appreciate it. If you want to buy a book, they're available in the bookstore. So, questions, comments, observations?
I have a question.
Sure.
So, in Africa, where many of the slaves were, how did somebody like subject them to being sold there or put on? Did some think that they were being tricked and going to somewhere that provided more opportunity help? What was that process?
Yeah, depending on the years. Like different years, different things happen. But there was a time period where usually even the black people themselves captured their friends and their neighbors and put them up for sale. That happened, but not always. But that was part of it. Sometimes they just grabbed people randomly. Sometimes the British had it down to a science. The British in the 1780s, they actually had like a military go out and get like a census, find out who the black people were, and before they actually grabbed you, this doesn't sound very familiar. They went and grabbed him, saying, "He's perfect for me. Let's grab this guy." And then the next week they grabbed somebody else, and they kept him in pens. Didn't tell the parents or anything. They kept him in pens. And then eventually, when it came time to the British boat came over, they had the whole big slave group over. So depending on the period of time, they did it. But there were a number of ways that they acquired the slaves. Good question. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So did the Underground Railroad actually run through this part of the Cape and was an entry point for slaves to get up to Canada?
Basically, yeah. We've ran every town. I've been in probably 5 different Underground Railroad homes, definitely. There's one in Salem, one in Sandwich, there's one in Hyannis, there's one in Chatham too. It's an old church that was reconverted to a home. You could tell it was a big basement and they had a hiding area and so on. So you could definitely see it was used, but yeah, every town had a place to keep people. Yeah, people think of it the Underground. I would say, rather than an Underground Railroad, because the question was like a automotive one, I would say it's Underground Maritime. Most of the slaves got here by boat. Probably 70% of the boats at some point. I mean, there were different parts of travel, but a boat is so much easier. If you had to go state by state by state, you get covered, there's a lot of barriers in between, you have a hard time to make it. But if you can get on a boat and make it all the way to Boston or beyond, perfect, and it's a lot easier to make your way forward there. So I think the maritime much more than the railroad, I think, but they had both. Yes, sir.
Were there one or two primary sources of information that helped in your research with what you just shared?
A whole bunch of books. I mean, there was nothing, like I said, people couldn't really talk about it. So I read a lot of journals of sea captains and a lot of journals from people, but it was very limited and very hard to get. So they had to kind of make inferences sometimes and make some deductions. But it was not plain. It was not, when you think about it, but nobody wanted to talk about it. It's just not a type of topic that people say, I'm so proud to be a slaveholder, but it didn't happen.
Thank you.
That's a good question. It's a good question. It's a really tough place.
I have one other question.
Sure.
When they did make it to Canada, what kind of situation did they encounter there then? Was there a definite anti-slavery attitude, or were there opportunities available?
It was much more relaxed there. I mean, they accepted them more than we did, basically, and they didn't give them a hard time. I know, like in Maine, Yarmouth, Maine, Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, there definitely was like a period of people who kind of welcomed them. So they were easier, much easier for them. In fact, there's still a fairly big black population in 2 towns in Nova Scotia, which were originally, you can trace them back to the slave people way back when. Yes, sir.
Did the British outlaw slavery much earlier than?
Not later, not earlier. It was pretty big. I mean, we did it in Massachusetts. We were the first state to do it, 1780. England, I think, in the 1800s, they finally did, like 1804, maybe something in there. But they finally did with it. Some of the worst slave traders were English. They were barbaric. They would just take big boats of sometimes 1,000 people at a time and just bring them over. It's no way to make money. We were bad, but they were worse. The other two countries that did was Portugal. Portugal and Spain, Portugal and England. They're probably notorious for their poor slave habits. Yes, ma'am.
Did you run across in your research any information like about the specific slaves? Like the slaves, if they had a family?
Yeah, some, not a great deal. Like I mentioned in the beginning, Troy and someone. I mean, they lived a decent life. They didn't want black slaves in their home. Most of the people who owned slaves kept them separate. They weren't allowed to go into and they were very restricted where they can go. Like on Sunday, they couldn't leave the building and all. They had to stay where they are. They couldn't. I would say dated. They couldn't date. The reason why they let them date another, either a Wampanoag or another black woman. They wanted that because if they had children, it's more money for the owner. So they encouraged that, to match a woman and a man together. But beyond that, they really didn't give them much freedom. They couldn't go shopping. If you behaved yourself and didn't cause trouble, you probably had a decent life, a moderate life. If you were an upstart or whatever word you want to use, they weren't treated too well. They were treated pretty poorly.
Yeah, I guess in the 1757 census, they were just hash marks and no names, and sometimes trying to trace back in the 1860, they might have had names, and maybe some of the stories that you read from the owners might talk about.
Yeah, but like I said, most people didn't keep diaries. There weren't that many diaries back then. If they did, like Captain Cobb, this was what happened a lot of times too. Like a lot of homes that I know of, both in Chandler and Brewster, had like a separate entranceway and with a small staircase because they would have indentured servants. He didn't have black slaves, but he would keep indentured servants, like a very narrow staircase, 2 very small bedrooms that would keep a domestic slave, a domestic servant, man or woman, there. They did the farming and all of that, but that was it. That's basically what they did. And then even there, they didn't want indentured service. They were treated almost like slaves. They sometimes were allowed to be in the house during the meals, sometimes not, depending on the owner, how the owner felt about the indentured servants. Even they were treated kind of poorly for the most part. And there's a lot of sexual abuse. That is documented. Almost every trial, it's like 3/4 of all trials have been to like one of the owners, attacked a female with a horrendous track record of what happened there. This was not a good situation at all. So whatever you do, buy my book. And don't take any slaves, please. Don't bring them home.